She was worth billions. But tonight, she was on her hands and knees polishing marble no one would notice. Until everyone did. The foyer of the Kang estate swallowed sound like a sleeping animal. Light from a chandelier pooled across veined stone, and Zuri Bennett's reflection looked stranger than the woman it mirrored. A 26-year-old with the posture of a CEO wearing a cheap cotton uniform. Her fingers moving with the same exacting patience she used to inspect quarterly reports. She scrubbed where the light creased the floor, watching dust settle into the tiny cracks. Every stroke was careful, precise, the discipline of someone used to getting results. 3 months earlier, the numbers had made a different kind of argument. A potential $200 million partnership with a hotel chain that could redefine Bennett Global's presence in Asia. Kang's hotels were widely admired, immaculate service, dramatic lobbies, ads that sold fantasy, yet at the edges of those glossy images were rumors, old whispers of old loyalties, murky wires of money the board wanted cleaned or cut. Zuri had sent investigators. Reports were ambiguous. Legal could delay. Accountant after accountant found ways to explain shadow flows. Investors wanted clarity. Zuri wanted to know the truth herself, so she traded a tailored suit for an apron and a name tag she'd never use again. The reasoning was cold and practical. If you only look at a deal through paper, you miss what you can hear in a hallway, see in the way power behaves in private. But there was another, quieter reason, something about testing dignity. She had watched people bow to money too often to trust their smiles when it counted. Going undercover was both due diligence and a lesson, maybe even a test of her own patience. Isabella Kang was the kind of woman who made that test personal. She had silver glint nails, the voices of a dozen stylists, and a laugh that clipped people into pieces. She liked to remind staff of their place. She liked it in public. Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, carried the weight of 1,000 small wrongs in her soft, steady hands and refused to respond in kind. Dave, the head of household security, watched everything with a wry reserve. He would later tell Zuri that Isabella's cruelty was performative. It fed the room and starved the people on whom the stars depend. If Isabella invited a maid to attend a gala, it would be a knife humiliation served on a silver tray. So when the printed invitation arrived, tucked into a laundry basket as if it had been left there by accident, Zuri felt the same calculation that first led her to the house, the work of 1,000 small decisions. The card read, in gold-pressed script, "Charity Gala, honorary attendees." Underneath, Isabella had added a handwritten note, sharp and small, "Dress code, appropriate. Maid welcome, as sports." There was a brief, private furor less at the insult than at the opportunity. She could leave. That would be clean. It would avoid spectacle. The board might even quietly move the partnership on her absence. But Zuri didn't want to exit quietly. She wanted to prove a point about dignity and consequence in front of every person whose opinions bent the path of the money she managed. If the household wanted to make a joke of a human being, the joke would ricochet. And she had allies she hadn't named. Mrs. Park, whose quiet afternoons of advice had become a moral map. Dave, who started as suspicious and turned protective. Marcus Chun, her head of security off-site, who'd build the technical scaffolding to keep her safe. If you love a great reveal, hit like. The 3 months that followed flowed in a montage of small, intimate scenes, brief, telling moments stitched into the daily fabric of service. Zuri learned the cadence of cleaning, the way silver demanded different attention than how guests smelled of antiseptic and confidence, how staff moved like a single organism beneath the show above. She catalogued the household's power plays the way she once read balance sheets. Mrs. Park taught her how to fold a sheet into a rectangle that felt like a promise rather than a task. She told Zuri once, while standing at a window watching the city bloom beyond the estate walls, that dignity does not require a crown. It requires being seen. Zuri listened and took notes in a phone she kept hidden. Not of numbers, but of manner. How a manager spoke to a cleaner. How a hostess dismissed a request with the flick of a wrist. Those notes would later look like pages from a study on human currency. Overhearing conversations became a skill. Zuri learned the rhythms of the household's early mornings and late-night stamens strategy meetings in the study. Staff discussing petty grievances in whispers. Isabella's calls to designers that sounded like thunder. In the kitchen, cooks exchanged talk of suppliers and small acts of kindness. In the staff quarters, someone made tea for another who couldn't sleep. Little loyalties formed, thin threads that could become rope. Dave came at Zuri with a measured suspicion that masked respect. Initially, he approached as one security head might approach any oddity, a young woman whose manner didn't fit her role. He asked questions, watched her, tested her. There was a confrontation in a hallway, one rainy night, 2 guards, a locked door, the hum of the furnace. Dave lifted his chin and said, "What security always says. Who are you, really?" Zuri answered with truth and distance. She did not reveal her wealth, but she did not lie about her intent. She told him she was there to see how this house worked. The way she said it was not a confession but a promise. Dave, who'd seen loyalty bend into something dark and sharp, decided then to shadow her with a new eye. Not to expose her, but to protect what he began to suspect was purposeful. Marcus was the unseen hand at the edge of the narrative, her right arm at Bennett Global, her secure voice when she needed it. He organized the off-site logistics with professional detachment, discreet shipments. A tailor intercepted in Milan. A jeweler who worked in a world of discreet ledgers and insurance clauses. Marcus's involvement never felt like theatrics. It felt like precaution, a way of ensuring that the reveal would not become a risk for any staff who could be harmed by association. He coordinated with Dave, using legal buffers and safe houses like chess pieces. They never touched anything that smelled illegal. They moved within contracts, deposits, and the language of authorized spending. Kang was not simply a villain in pinstripes. In private, he sometimes showed a tiredness that didn't match his polished public persona. There were mornings when the man who helmed the hospitality empire would walk into the staff kitchen and stand in silence for a moment, as if he was listening to a frequency no one else heard, maybe the undertone of obligations he could not entirely escape. Rumors of old debts and old allegiances trailed him in the press. But when he spoke with staff in low voices, something in his tone suggested remorse as much as calculation. Zuri filed those observations away with the rest. The world is rarely a white and black ledger. As the invitation day drew nearer, small tensions became a coil. Isabella's cruelty sharpened into performance pieces, derisive jokes at table-setting drills, a staged reprimand meant to send a ripple through the staff. Zuri felt the pressure like heat. She could have taken the slight, wiped the smile off her face, and continued to gather facts. Instead, she began to plan the one event she would allow to be public. Her presence at the gala transformed from an insult into a stage. The night before the gala, plans arrived like soft thunder. Marcus flew in with a quiet economy of motion. His suitcase held fabric swatches and receipts, not what anyone would expect. He met Zuri in a small service stairwell and, without theatrics, handed her a photograph folded in tissue. It was the Versace gown they'd commissioned, midnight blue silk, with a sculpted neckline that would catch the lights of the ballroom like a night sky, rearranged. There was also a slim envelope. Insurance details for a necklace, Cartier paperwork, drafted and insured under a corporate umbrella. Zuri slid the paper into the inner pocket of her dress uniform, then returned to the sink to scrub one last stubborn stain. That evening, the staff did what they always did. They prepared the house to hold a different kind of life for an evening. The cooks trimmed fat from their conversations. The waiters practiced smiles like choreography. And Mrs. Park moved with a focused tenderness that made the house feel less like a machine and more like a shelter. She came to Zuri in the dim of the supply room and, with a hand on Zuri's shoulder, said only, "Remember who you are when they look at you like you're less." There was no advice in that sentence, only the clarity of simple truth. The stakes were not only Zuri's pride. If Isabella's mockery became a public spectacle, it would harden a culture where service could be erased for amusement. But there was also the deal itself. Reputations of whole institutions could hinge on a single night. Zuri saw the partnership not as a prize, but as a responsibility. Whoever owned the hotels would change the lives of thousands of staff. She wanted it to be a force that raised standards, not one that bought silence. On the night of the gala, the house breathed differently. Staff uniforms had been polished until they reflected chandeliers. The estate's gardens were trimmed as if for a portrait. Guests arrived in little worlds of attention: the major donors, the press, the local elite. Isabella flitted through the lobby like a monarch, smile sharp, voice tuned to make lesser sounds feel hollow. Tammin stood at her side, a man in tuxedo who carried weight like a private treaty. The ballroom itself was a bowl of light and whisper, where the city's polite cruelties dissolved into applause and the rustle of fabric. Somewhere in the orchestration, Robert Chu, a board member of a firm whose presence could legitimize the partnership, scanned the room with detached interest. The doors to the ballroom were like the mouth of a theater. People turned as they always do when someone new crosses a threshold. Zuri's entrance was paired of cinematic frills. Staff escorted her to a small service corridor where Marcus smoothed the dresses back. Dave positioned a silent nod, and Mrs. Park stood in a doorway, eyes wet with something like pride. Zuri breathed once and stepped into the light. When she appeared, the air seemed to rewrite itself. The midnight blue silk moved like liquid midnight. The dress was cut to a sculpted silhouette that made her look less like what she had been today and more like a force the room had not planned for. A Cartier necklace, modest in temperament, but brilliant enough to scatter light, lay at her throat, an exclamation point that was not about wealth, but about deliberate, inevitable revelation. The dress, alone insured and styled under Marcus's meticulous direction, was valued at $2 million. It wasn't just about price. It was about the choice that someone who could have left everything behind chose instead to show up and be seen. At first, there was silence, that electric kind that happens when everyone recalibrates. Conversations stalled. A glass slipped from a hand. Isabella's face lost the small geometry it relied on. Her laugh, practiced to a point of cruelty, vanished like smoke. For several seconds, the entire ballroom seemed to orbit Zuri. Cameras tilted, donors adjusted ties, a hostess forgot an announced speech. The moment was not about opulence. It was about incongruity. The woman they thought a joke stood composed and immovable, and the room had to decide what to do with that incongruity. Zuri walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the stage but refused to be staged. Her eyes scanned the room, not to intimidate, but to reclaim a space that had been used to belittle people like her rowers, to pretend they didn't exist. She paused before Isabella, close enough for the world to hear, but far enough to keep the dignity required for the reveal. It was a surgical pause. It let the silence hang like a curtain, then slightly pulled it aside. Her speech began like a scalpel, precise and unflinching. "Good evening," she said, voice clear enough to carry. "I am Zuri Bennett. For the last 3 months, I have worked in this house not as a guest, not as a consultant, but as someone who wanted to see how the machine runs when the cameras are off." She let the sentence hang, letting some people in the room shuffle. Then she continued, softer now, addressing not just Isabella but the fishing net of assumptions in the room. "We all make choices about whom we elevate, whom we humiliate, and what we ignore. I came to learn whether the hotel group would uphold its duty to the people who keep it running, the maids, the cooks, the porters whose dignity is not a line item." Her words were measured, rising with a discreet force. "I do not come here to shame anyone for their past. Organizations change. People can choose a different path. But if we are going to invest $200 million into a future that claims to be clean, then transparent dignity must be part of that future. That includes wages, protections, and respect, things the staff here have earned by labor and loyalty, not by being thin characters in a social drama." She spoke for only a few minutes, but the cadence did its work: personal anecdote, public accusation, and an offer of resolution. "I arrived here a guest of circumstance," she said finally, looking at Tammin, just enough to hold him in the frame. "I leave here offering partnership only if it is a partnership in truth. If the Kang group will commit, publicly and contractually, to raise standards for every worker, to place independent audits on labor practices, and to remove from leadership anyone who profits from humiliation, then Bennett Global will stand behind this company." Her gaze swept the room, resting on Robert Chun, for the barest of beats. "And if not, then the deal does not go forward." For the audience, the speech landed like a verdict. It didn't name names beyond the policies it demanded. It didn't seek revenge. It sought accountability. That difference saved it from the trap of cruelty. Isabella tried to answer with a laugh that trembled. She attempted to trim the moment with a line meant to restore the room's balance. But the balance was broken. What happened next was as much social physics as it was legal consequence. Robert Chun, who had been watching the values dance across the room, rose and finished the first sentence of action. He acknowledged the clarity of Zuri's conditions and requested a private meeting to sign a memorandum of intent, notarized and witnessed. The board's landscape shifted in minutes as murmurs turned into nods. Donors adjusted their posture not because they loved the language but because accountability, when articulated, obliges action. Isabella's face changed over the course of half an hour, from irritation to something like disbelief. Social capital evaporated faster than the perfume she favored. People who had once laughed with her at staff jokes now found themselves uncomfortable in her presence. Some of her friends, those whose reputations depended on appearing kindly, amused slowly, their hands busy with champagne glasses that no longer tasted celebratory. That night, her social influence folded like a map that had no place for her on its roots. Taman's reaction was complicated. His first instinct was reflexive defense spokesmen and PR teams training their faces, but something in Zuri's speech cut deeper than PR. He stepped forward in a way that surprised many. He asked, plainly, how the household's practices could be altered. He asked Mrs. Park what protections staff needed. He told a small group he would accept an independent audit and would divest leadership roles that enabled humiliative practices, whether those words were born of guilt, hope, or a desire for legitimacy. They marked the beginning of a shift. The partnership, if it passed the newly articulated tests, would be conditional on institutional changes, not simply financial opt-in. In the days that followed, the household's internal ripples became public waves. Isabella retreated into a smaller social circle. Invitations thinned. Her allies became thinly voiced. The press smelled the scandal and chased the contours of it, but the narrative was not purely tabloid. It was about accountability, spelled out in contracts and auditors' visits, and more quietly, it was about what happens when someone refuses to let humiliation be the currency of an evening. Taman and Zuri's relationship did not arrive as an immediate romance. It began in the aftermath with the awkward, human cadence of two people who had been forced into intimacy by proximity and honesty. He came to the staff kitchen one evening to speak with Mrs. Parkin. In that conversation, did not posture. He asked for stories about staff needs, their families, things that had nothing to do with ledgers. Zuri noticed him listening in a way that suggested a genuine hunger to learn rather than a cover for control. Over time, the conversations grew longer, more complex, and less transactional. There was a softness that matured at its own pace. He showed signs of wanting to repair things that were not easily fixed by contracts alone. Weeks later, Taman announced publicly that he would file for divorce. The decision was messy and just and inescapable. His marriage to Isabella had been a partnership of different designs, one that had worn just as thin. Divorce did not erase the past, nor did it absolve managers of their responsibilities, but it unclinched a status quo long held in place by appearances. Meanwhile, Zuri used the public attention to create something constructive. She pledged funding structured, transparent, and independent to a charity focused on elevating the status of service workers in hospitality, education funds, emergency relief, legal advocacy, and a public campaign to shift cultural norms away from humiliation. Mrs. Park was named to an advisory role. Her voice guided policy and gifted it the authority it needed. The charity's launch was not spectacle. It was a quiet gathering where staff members were invited to speak, and the microphones were handed to people whose names rarely hit headlines. Dave's role transformed as well. He continued to manage security, but now his vigilance had a different edge. Protection for staff who might be targeted for retaliation, coordination of audits that verified commitments, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting channel where workers could voice concerns without fear of reprisal. The security of a house had, in its own small orbit, become a force for structural protection. Isabella found herself at a table with fewer chair legs. She tried to appeal, to perform remorse, on a stage defined by optics. Some took her gestures at face value and welcomed her back to social circuits. Others recognized the architecture of power that had been rooted through her and refused the invitation. The choice landed, like all choices, due external consequence, mirrored internal reckoning, and she discovered that social capital, once lost in a world governed by accountability, was hard to rebuild. For Zuri and Taman, there was an awkward tenderness that unfolded in the private edges of their lives. He was not a redeemed saint, and she was not an unscathed heroine. They were two people who had found each other at a junction where prudence met compassion. Romance grew, not as a cure, but as a partnership. Shared dinners where conversation was not strategy, nights walking the city where neither role mattered, and the slow rebuilding of trust in small, consistent acts-keeping promises about contracts, showing up for meetings with staff, and showing neither contempt nor condescension. Months later, the charity's first public gala far from the Kang estate was a ceremony of quiet celebration. Mrs. Park stood near the stage, hands folded, and when the applause came, it landed like recognition rather than spectacle. The organization's first grants went to workers who had been members of staff in the hospitality sector, scholarships for children, emergency housing funds, legal aid. Those small contractions of wealth had real effects. Rent paid, a mother's surgery covered, a child's education funded. The transformation was not dramatic in the way tabloids like, but it was real in the only way that sustainably matters. In interviews that followed, Zuri never framed the night as some act of revenge. She spoke about dignity. She spoke about systems. She offered a narrative where accountability had teeth without becoming punitive for its own sake. People asked if she regretted using her money like a spotlight. She answered that wealth given attention can either silence the weak or amplify them. She had chosen the latter. There were skeptics. Some said the spectacle of the dress could be used to distract from the meat of policy. Others worried about the notion that one individual's dramatic entrance could shift institutional behavior. Zuri accepted those critiques as part of the story's complexity. She knew spectacle alone achieves little. Spectacle, paired with clauses, auditors, and community leadership, creates leverage. She understood that change required endurance longer than cameras stayed interested. Through all of it, Mrs. Park remained the quiet moral engine. She took meetings with directors and taught them the uncomfortable art of listening to clearance people. She worked with Dave to design an anonymous reporting process that actually worked because it was simple and respectful. She was present when staff were offered raises and when people were given promotion tracks that they could actually follow. When the charity awarded its first fellowship, she cried not because she was moved by money, but because she had watched people be seen as human beings, not props. The world transformed in small, pragmatic ways. The Kang hotels instituted transparent policies around wages and independent audits. The board monitored compliance. Investors who had once prioritized growth over ethics learned the same lesson. Zuri had. Sustainability of brand relies on the respect built into its operations. The change was neither immediate nor perfect, but it was a direction that could be measured by new reports and, more importantly, new human stories. As for Isabella, the humbling was part social fall and part mirror. She remained committed to social events, but her performances were thinner. She attended a few charity events later, perhaps trying to re-enter a world that had once elevated her. Sometimes she apologized. Sometimes she defended herself. The story of public humiliation is rarely neat. People recover in different ways. The scene that night had been a complicated moral turning, not a cartoonish That nuance was important to Zuri. Cruelty deserved correction, not revelry. A few months after the gala, at a small press conference, Robert Chun read a statement on behalf of several board members. The memorandum of intent had been signed, a timeline for audits established, and an independent committee including representatives of staff would oversee implementation. The substance of the partnership had shifted. It no longer served simply to expand an empire. It was now a test of how a company could enact dignity as policy. Zuri's name circulated with two adjectives that sometimes bled into caricature: bold and dramatic. She learned to accept both, and to point back to the people the attention was meant to lift. She and Tammin continued to navigate their relationship with a cautious hopefulness. Their connection had been forged in a room full of power dynamics, and they kept recognizing those dynamics in their private choices, choosing not to let the spectacle take the lead, choosing to share credit with the people who mattered most to the hotel's operation. Looking back, Zuri would call the night a lesson in the currency of dignity. When the ballroom doors opened and the maid arrived like a storm in midnight silk, it wasn't the price tag of the dress that mattered. It was the assertion that being seen, heard, and respected is not a favorite's a baseline. What lingered most after the cameras and columns moved on was humane. Staff who had once whispered about their futures began to speak openly at meetings. Mrs. Park's presence on the charity board ensured that policies had flesh. Dave moved into a role overseeing staff safety initiatives across the chain. People who had been objects of amusement became partners in shaping workplace culture. The victory was not final. It was the start of practical steps that could be audited and iterated. If you asked Zuri later what she had wanted in the first place, she would say two things: truth and dignity. She wanted the deal to be clear, clean money, clean intent, not to happen at all. And she wanted the staff who made grand lobbies possible to be treated as partners worthy of those lobbies. Beauty. The dress had been a statement only because it forced the room to stop and listen. It was not a trophy so much as a microphone. When the headlines diminished and new stories took their place, the charity kept doing the quiet work. Zuri sometimes returned to the house not in uniform, but as someone who had learned the value of proximity. She and Tammin attended some of the charity's informal dinners, not as lovers on display, but as participants in a project that sought to reconfigure how wealth and power operated in one small universe. The moral of the tale was not theatrical revenge, but a sober commitment to accountability. The night the maid arrived in a $2 million dress changed less because of spectacle than because it imposed a requirement: either do better, or do not be surprised when people refuse to pretend otherwise. The most meaningful aftermath was measurable. Policy language that included staff representation, funding that went directly to workers, and a cultural shift where public humiliation could no longer be accepted as the price of entertainment. Over time, a certain justice settled, not the kind that bends knees with poetic finality, but the kind that remakes institutions by insisting that dignity is a baseline. That insistence created consequences and opportunities. Individuals who had been ignored were given avenues to speak. Organizations were held to public commitments, and a woman who could have remained anonymous used her resources to insist on a different standard. So when the story circulates now, remember the small facts. A young billionaire who scrubbed marble to listen, a cruel socialite who misjudged the cost of her amusement, a security chief who chose protection over exposure, and a head housekeeper who gave the moral clarity every system needs. Remember that the gown, the midnight blue silk, the perfect cut wasn't a trophy, it was a tool of insistence, a way to make a room of powerful people meet their responsibilities in full view. Which moment hit you hard as Zuri on her knees polishing the marble, the hush that fell when she entered, or the moment of accountability when the board stood with her conditions? Comment below and tell us if this story resonated. Subscribe for more dramatic, carefully told tales that look beyond spectacle to the human consequences of power.